This video is about the art of illusion, but not visual illusion, a different kind of illusion. The illusion of value, financial or otherwise. It fundamentally comes down to good art versus bad art, not just how you would define it, but how you give it value. How would you define good art or bad art? You might say it comes down to personal taste or that the experts can define it for us, but is that the case? I've seen really poorly executed paintings sell at community art shows when really good pieces in the same price range are passed over. That most certainly comes down to personal taste, sentiment, or ignorance, but let's look at universal values here. The question to ask is, why are you giving visual attention to images? Is it because they engage you or because you have been told they have value? And how much time do you give to each painting when you visit an art gallery? Why was the band Queen so popular? What was its value? Was it because they were great musicians, or was it because Freddie Mercury knew how to connect to an audience? It was both, wasn't it? Quality plus connection. Whenever I enter a gallery space, I run quickly over all the exhibits and choose just a few to actually engage with, not necessarily because I like them, they might just look interesting. But then I allow time to really absorb what I'm looking at. Is it well executed? What techniques has the artist used? What's the focus of the painting? The artist's intent, perhaps, and whether it engages me. If I offered you this painting for $10,000, would you buy it? I wouldn't. To me, it's an awful painting. It's dark with cool colours. Even the skin tones are cool. What about this one? I wouldn't buy it either, even though it is one of the most famous paintings in the world. These two works are by the same artist, Leonardo da Vinci. Madonna of the Rocks, the first one, is insured at several hundred million euros. The Mona Lisa is insured for over 800 million. The Mona Lisa is undoubtedly well executed and certainly of historic interest for art aficionados, but really it's underwhelming when you meet it face to face, while the Louvre is full of fantastic, although sometimes overwhelming, paintings which are much more interesting. As for the enigmatic smile, well, to me it just looks bland and uninteresting. But why are those paintings then so valuable? Who creates the narrative? Who sets the standard? What we are looking at is a record of history, of the past, not at the art itself. The thing is that most paintings at the time of Da Vinci were commissioned by wealthy patrons, so they came with a set pedigree and have been passed on through rich patrons over the years since. For those players, that's the value. One thing I have found over the years is that very few people are discerning when it comes to visual arts. They're easily intimidated by something they don't understand and feel there's a problem with their perception when it doesn't meet their expectation based on someone else's narrative. It's the same with so many world-famous icons, artistic or otherwise, and certain entities with vested financial interests know this. The Mona Lisa earns the Louvre huge financial gains, not because people pay to see the painting itself, but because they come to see it and then spend their euros in the cafes, restaurants, and the gift shop. The more visitors, the more financial remuneration. So the illusion of grandiosity is worth perpetuating. But that's just a small part of the picture. At the time those paintings were created, there was no such thing as photography, so it was the only visual record of the world, especially portraits. So nothing was done for popular entertainment, and the life of an artist was hard. Paintings were meaningful in that they were recognizable images, and the artist needed to be highly skilled to execute them. So, of course, their financial value is partly tied up with their age, the fact that the artist has long since moved on and there are no more of his works forthcoming, partly with their provenance, and the fact that they're well executed, so it makes sense. Perhaps one factor is also sentiment. I have a poor quality drawing executed by a famous artist when he was a student, and I'm extremely fond of it because I inherited it from my late father, who purchased it from the artist at a student art exhibition. And I see in it the shadow at the more mature works to come. So the value for me is almost entirely sentimental because I don't believe it's a drawing I would have purchased of my own volition. So having considered paintings from past eras, let's consider 20th to 21st century artworks, which cover a number of disciplines, including installations. How do we value modern art? What is its provenance? What about Jeff Koons' sculpture Puppy, purchased in 1997 for $1.2 million or euros, I'm not sure which? This installation is a framework in the shape of a dog, which contains shelves on which are placed pots of flowers. I imagine the cost of creating it might have been maybe $200,000. So where did the rest of the money go? Why did it draw such a high sum and presume to be a work of art? I define anyone to explain the artistic value of this construction. And his installation entitled Rabbit, or maybe you could call it a small sculpture. They're decorative and entertaining for sure, but when it comes to artistic merit, show me their credentials. One has to understand that their value has very little to do with art, even if you do like them, and they are fun. But I should make it clear that my comments about them are not just value judgments, but real reflections on taste versus merit. For me, much of the contemporary art world is about a cynical exploitation of a gullible public, modern Western materialism, and a stalemate in an art world that has had to deal with the implications of abstraction and expressionism, with which anyone without serious technical skills can entertain themselves, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's opened up a world previously unavailable to the average person, enabled some wonderful artworks to be produced for public pleasure, and allowed people to indulge in the very healthy practice of self-expression. Painting, drawing, and sculpture can be very healing practices on a personal level. I teach abstraction myself, so it's not an issue for me. But will people be lining up to view Puppy in 300 years' time? What's its provenance? It's owned by the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, created by the Guggenheim family, who became wealthy through mining interests rather than aristocratic connections. Will it be of historic interest one day? Will it even exist for long? A crowdfunding campaign was launched in 2021 to raise 100,000 euros for restoration, less than 25 years since it was installed. So even now we're in a situation where these so-called major works are purchased by wealthy patrons, so they do, in a sense, have a pedigree. The difference is that these modern works are for popular consumption, not private patronage. How about Andy Warhol? His drawings were not remarkable, and if he was a painter, accomplished or otherwise, there's no evidence. His images are a commentary on a materialistic society for sure, but is it art? Or Marina Abramovich, with her very troubled childhood, whose creations allude to some very dark and unhealthy aspects of the human experience. What kind of world do we live in where people are happy to consume a huge cake in the form of a human body, blood and all, for entertainment? Is that an artistic commentary on life or an unhealthy delusion? Abramovich is a dedicated and authentic creator, there's no doubt about that. And one could never argue it's not a legitimate form of expression. But in the end, it still comes back to what our society values. And the reality is that the value of art and what art is comes down to personal perception and persuasion. If you can persuade your clientele that something has value, then they'll pay for it. The majority of middle-class homes are filled with items that have no artistic merit or intrinsic value, and yet we give our money away for a dream, not a tangible reality. And if a famous celebrity can be persuaded to buy something you have created, then the value of your work or product will soar, not because of its intrinsic value, but because there's a perception that if someone famous owns it, then by imitating them, you will move into their perceived realm of influence and value. I would contend that most public art, that is, in the high-end art world, is all about finance and investment and nothing to do with any intrinsic value of the artworks per se. And it's presented to the public as entertainment under the guise of art, as are so many movies and popular music. David Hockney's bigger Grand Canyon is valued at around 6 million Australian dollars, a relatively small sum compared to some of his contemporaries. And yet this painting is remarkable in its conception and implementation, despite the fact that on the surface it looks like pop art. Hockney was an original, intelligent and authentic artistic voice, not playing with materialistic values, but genuinely exploring visual perception and in the process creating an astounding experience for the viewer. But his work is less valued than, say, Jeff Koons' Rabbit, which sold for over 90 million in 2019. Hockney spent years working on his Grand Canyon paintings. I suspect Jeff Koons came up with the concept of puppy, designed it, and no doubt had it manufactured by a second or third party, not by his own hand or his own body for that matter. One contains the brushstrokes of the artist, the other has no direct connection with the artist, but is more highly valued. If Puppy stood outside another public institution rather than an art gallery, would it have a different meaning? Why is it art? Because it's outside an art gallery? Andy Warhol is believed to have said, it's not the art that sells, it's the artist. And who, aside from art galleries, purchases these works? Wealthy people and corporations. So-called art isn't purchased for the sake of the art. It's an investment. So the perception that the artwork will have a higher future financial appraisal raises the value of the artwork, and I won't define the implications of that. You get it, I'm sure. I watched a program about 20 years ago around the auction of a Picasso painting that was pretty second-rate. I don't remember the title, but it wasn't an attractive or even interesting painting, and yet it sold for something like $43 million at the time. Imagine if your signature was worth $43 million, because that's what was the value, not the painting itself. When the late Australian artist Fred Williams knew he hadn't long to live, he destroyed all the paintings in his studio that he considered not worthy of his signature, so dealers couldn't take advantage of his legacy. He was the first Australian artist to hold a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but the highest price with one of his works was just over $3 million. Fred was a gentle soul, introspective, a quiet family man, definitely not a showman, but his works were highly original and set the standard of Australian art, or at least landscape art, for the generations to come. Not controversial enough, though, too much from the heart, from the soul, to be at that next level. He wasn't highly connected enough, and he was certainly not a showman. But then, speaking of Australian artists, we have the bad boy of Australian art, Brett Whiteley. Brett's painting Henry's Armchair, not one of his best works in my opinion, and I unashamedly admit to being a fan of his, sold for $4.5 million in 2020. He was technically very talented, but along with that came a complex and intriguing, extroverted, articulate, confident personality, had curly red hair and a cheeky persona. So it wasn't surprising he gained such a high profile in New York, where he studied, and with his wife, Wendy, befriended Janis Joplin and Bob Dylan, among other celebrities. So it's not surprising that his prices were commensurate with his contemporaries there at the time. At first glance, his work can appear to be a sensual form of expressionism, which it certainly is, but if you delve deeper, you find a very talented artist whose creative process was well thought out and deeply meaningful. And I've posted a link to one of the many videos on this interesting man below. The question about these contemporary artists isn't their pedigree and commitment. All of them undertook art studies, mostly at notable institutions, although Andy Warhol trained not in fine arts but as a designer, and that certainly shows in his work. The question in my mind is about how we value the visual arts, both socially and economically. Are some of the huge investments in them by publicly funded institutions validated by the entertainment value? There are some paintings out there which are so engaging, we want to spend time with them, to explore, to be caught up in that world beyond the flat surface of the canvas. Is there value in a work of art that can be passed over, or an installation for that matter, in 1 minute because there's nothing there to engage us in more depth? I can't answer that except from my own perspective, and I can't guarantee any degree of impartiality, but it's an entertaining conversation to be had nevertheless. I'm reminded of an imported modern art exhibition in Melbourne many years ago, which featured 2 exhibits I remember well. One was 3 canvases on easels, perhaps 60 centimetres square, painted entirely in black and completely featureless, with a label suggesting if you stood in front of them long enough, you'd eventually see an image. It may have been by Malevich, I can't remember. To my amusement, this seemed to be a very popular exhibit and was generally greeted with either amused smiles or sneers. But even more amusing was an anecdote by my father from the same exhibition, where a bale of sheep's wool on a stand had the undivided attention of a woman standing with the stylized pose of a connoisseur, and which she pondered with great concentration and apparent discernment. One of the attendants walked over to the bale, pulled a piece from it, and offered it to her, saying, "For you, madam." She was shocked and asked, "What's this for?" His response, "To pull over your eyes, madam." When you visit works of art, is your conversation afterwards about the works you loved, or the curiosities like those, or the ones you disliked? I think in most cases I could probably guess. I don't remember much else about that exhibition I mentioned. Which ones may have deserved your undivided attention, but you passed them by? I remember years ago seeing Rembrandt's Night Watch in Amsterdam, which is an incredible work, but I found I became more engaged with other works in the same gallery, less substantial in size, but some of them extremely interesting. I was the only person at the time who stopped to engage them, so I had them all to myself. It was delightful. Most people just walk past Puppy, but not so Anish Kapoor's sculpture Cloudgate, installed in Chicago outside the Art Institute, purchased at a cost of $23 million at the time. People will spend up to several hours playing around and observing the reflection in this inspired installation. It promotes engagement. It promotes contemplation. Its presentation is elegant but still relaxed, and it engages all the physical senses. The public needs no persuasion. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for joining me. Stay well, stay blessed.